Some bosses in WoW are hated for being too long, or for just being impossible to speed up on reclears. Whatever the reason, there are plenty of fights that people hated, and in this list, we'll be listing them. And at number 10, we have Hellfire Assault from Hellfire Citadel in the Warlords of Draenor. You log in, ready to raid, and what you get as your first boss in the final raid of the expansion, you get a Trash Gauntlet. Hellfire Assault isn't really a fight. It's a glorified escort mission where your raid has to babysit siege vehicles while waves of ads flood in from random doors. You can't burn it faster with better gear, and you can't pull off clever skips. At the start, the raid is tasked with defending Hellfire cannons, which must survive long enough to break down the gates of Hellfire Citadel. Throughout the fight, waves of Iron Horde ads will spawn from 4 preset locations. Each wave brings in different enemies: engineers that attempt to disable your cannons, siege vehicles that must be destroyed before they reach the gates, and basic infantry to distract your raid and pressure healers. The goal is to kill these ads before they can either destroy your siege weapons or delay their advance. There is no traditional boss with health that you can burn down. Instead, your raid is constantly repositioning across a large battlefield to intercept enemies. Your raid is forced to shift positions, stop priority targets from casting, and manage incoming waves, but the order and execution remains the same every single time. And the worst part? This is how you start the raid every single week. Every week, raid leaders would sigh knowing this was their first fight. Players would tab out, barely pay attention, and just wait for the cannon to finish without glitching. As an opening encounter, it set the tone for why so many people checked out of Warlords early. And at number 9, we have Spoils of Pandaria from the Siege of Orgrimmar in Mist of Pandaria. Spoils of Pandaria is another non-traditional boss fight. It's split into 2 rooms, where your raid divides into 2 separate teams. Each team's responsible for opening crates to spawn enemies, and every crate adds energy to a room-wide meter. The goal is to fill each meter to the required energy amount by defeating enemies and using the machinery inside. But there's a catch. You can't just power through it. Going too fast might lock the fight, and going too slow can trigger an enrage. There's no single boss to focus on, just a sequence of small ad packs and mini-bosses that come out of boxes. Most of them aren't particularly interesting or dangerous, but they come in overwhelming volume. The design forces coordination and pacing, but in the most repetitive way possible. Once you've done it once, you've seen everything the fight has to offer. Every pull basically plays out the same. You might notice a pattern with the bosses that are going to be on this list. Because of the energy requirements, every crate needed to be calculated. Small crates gave less energy, large ones gave more, and if you were too slow, the room would enrage. So every pull became about counting numbers, opening boxes in specific orders, and handling the resulting mobs efficiently. That consistency made it one of the most tedious parts of Siege of Orgrimmar. Even when you outgeared the content, you couldn't really go that much faster. You had to stop and wait for the right energy numbers on the other side. Every group that farmed this raid for months on end grew tired of this fight, as it wasn't really challenging. It was just something you had to do in order to clear the next boss. And at number 8, we have Malygos from the Eye of Eternity and Wrath of the Lich King. Malygos is the only boss in the Eye of Eternity raid, a single room encounter that attempts to deliver a cinematic climax. The fight is divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 is fairly straightforward. The raid spreads out to avoid arcane breath while managing power sparks that float towards Malygos and increases damage if they reach him. Players have to intercept and kill these sparks to gain a temporary damage buff, all while dodging vortexes that throw players into the air and disrupt casting. Phase 2 transitions when Malygos hits 50% HP. He lifts off and summons platforms while summoning a swarm of Nexus Lords and Scions of Eternity. The Lords dive into platforms to attack players in melee, while the Scions fire dangerous range attacks. DPS must kill these ads quickly while also taking down the Scions that hover around the room. This part of the fight is more chaotic, requiring players to move from platform to platform to avoid damage and line of sight range mobs. Then comes Phase 3, the Dragon Riding phase. The room shatters and all of the players mount red drakes. Each drake has a unique set of abilities unrelated to the player's class. DPS rotations are replaced by a 3-button combo system, where players spam 1-1-2 while building and maintaining combo points. Healers become limited to weak HOTS and damage mitigation abilities. It's no longer about how strong your character is, but how well you can manage a clunky, slow, and unfamiliar vehicle interface. Phase 1 and 2 are standard fare, with vortex knockups and power sparks that need to be managed carefully. But all that goes out the window in Phase 3. Your character's stats no longer matter. You're now pressing 1-1-2 on a dragon, hoping no one messes up their combo. The clunky vehicle mechanics combined with players having to reposition mid-air and track combo points made this fight a disaster in pugs. One person lagging out? Wipe. Someone not reading up on their new temporary UI? Wipe. If you were a melee player, congrats, the one phase you got to shine is over before the real DPS check begins. The Drakes don't scale with gear or class either. It's pure memory game muscle reflexes, which was punishing in early Wrath, and remained annoying even years later. A single missed heal or a stack drop on a Drake was often fatal. With so many players unused to vehicle mechanics, it became an infamous pug breaker. Malygos was innovative, but in the worst way. It took control away from the player and replaced it with a clumsy gimmick. The spectacle wore thin fast, and the mechanics only got more grating over time. And at number 7, we have Faction Champions from the Trial of Crusade raid in Wrath of the Lich King. Faction Champions broke every rule players had come to expect from raid encounters up to that point, and not in a good way. Instead of fighting a single boss with clear mechanics, you faced a team of enemy NPCs designed to mimic real PvP players. Each one is a different class with abilities that function just like the ones players use in Battlegrounds. They use crowd control, healing, interrupts, stuns, silences, and most importantly, they don't follow a threat table. That means tanks couldn't hold aggro. Healers were targeted randomly. Mages got focused and deleted in seconds. No one felt safe. You couldn't plan for this fight in the same way you did others. There was no scripted phases or clear transitions, and unlike PvP, you couldn't use normal tactics to reset or kite them properly. These NPCs didn't behave exactly like players, just closely enough to be frustrating. To beat the fight, raids had to approach it like a PvP skirmish. They prioritized enemy healers, locked them down with coordinated stuns and interrupts, and crowd-controlled key damage dealers long enough to eliminate high-priority targets. Classes with snares, fears, and stuns were vital. You had to control the flow of the fight or it would spiral out. This often meant assigning crowd control chains in advance and calling out interrupts alive, something you'd normally not have to do for raid fights. It wasn't a complicated fight mechanically, but that's part of what made it so exhausting. What was supposed to be a fun PvP style fight ended up being a chore, and there's a reason they never did a PvP only style fight like this again. And at number 6, we have Dark Animus from the Throne of Thunder in Mist of Pandaria. Dark Animus is one of those bosses that didn't just punish mistakes, it punished even thinking about pulling wrong. When you walked into the room, it wasn't just the boss waiting, it was a grid of inactive golems. Each one requires a resource called Anima to activate, and the resource came from orbs that drop from other golems when they die. The entire fight revolved around managing where the Anima went, in what order golems are activated, and keeping the ones that shouldn't be active from waking up too early. The goal was to activate a precise chain of golems to feed Anima into the boss, Dark Animus himself. But if you accidentally activated the wrong one, if your raid killed the wrong ad in the wrong spot, the Anima would flow incorrectly and your raid would wipe, even before the boss became fully active. To beat it, groups had to plan the entire fight before even pulling. Tanks had to kite ads into exact positions so they would die in the right spot. DPS had to not kill certain enemies, just weaken them until they were needed. Healers had to be ready for burst damage incoming from enemies that weren't even part of the final boss yet. And everyone, DPS and even healers alike, had to tank an ad, because they would give each other a buff if they were too close to each other, which could just one-shot a tank if too many of them were bound up. Once the boss finally activated, you still had to deal with his real mechanics, explosive ruptures, stacking debuffs, and tank swaps. But for most groups, the real boss fight wasn't Dark Animus himself. It was the first 90 seconds of the fight, where one wrong move, or literally just walking over another person's ad, meant starting over. And at number 5, we have Razorgore the Untamed from Blackwing Lair in Classic WoW. Razorgore isn't just one of the most hated boss fights. He's also one of the weirdest. When players walked into Blackwing Lair for the first time, they expected dragons, fire, and maybe some tricky mechanics. What they got was a control orb and an army of ads. The actual goal of the fight wasn't just to kill Razorgore right away. It was to mind control him using an orb and forcing him to destroy every single egg in the room. There were over 30 of them. During this, waves of enemies poured in from every corner, attacking both the raid and Razorgore himself. If Razorgore died before all the eggs were destroyed, it was an instant wipe. One player had to pick up the orb and control the boss, guiding him around the room and using his special ability to smash eggs while under heavy fire. This player couldn't move their own character while controlling Razorgore, and if it got interrupted or stunned, the control broke. That meant that the healers had to keep the controller alive, and the raid had to protect both the controller and Razorgore, all while surviving non-stop waves of orcs, mages, and dragonkin. To beat it, raids had to split into squads. One group to defend the orb controller, another to protect Razorgore, and others to slow or kill the ads. Players would rotate mind control duty, passing the orb between trusted members before the debuff expired. Everyone had to be in sync, or one slip up, a dead controller, a loose ad, a misclick meant failure. And killing the egg had a long 3-second cast time. So trying to clear this boss in future expansions when farming the raid for transmog took ages. It was such a pain that in Legion, they actually went in and removed the cast time so players could actually farm it easier. One of the few times they nerfed a boss fight years later. The fight was long, chaotic, and completely different from anything else at the time. And even when you finally cleared the eggs and got to kill the boss, he barely put up a fight. All the stress was in Phase 1, a fight remembered not for its challenge, but for how quickly it could fall apart. And at number 4, we have Galakras from the Siege of Orgrimmar in Mist of Pandaria. Galakras is technically a dragon boss, but you don't actually fight the dragon until the last few minutes. Most of the encounter is spent dealing with waves of ads, tower control, and long stretches of doing the same thing over and over again. The fight starts on the beach outside the gates of Orgrimmar. Your raid is pinned down while Kor'kon troops land in waves by ship. You can't reach Galakras yet. Instead, you have to defeat a steady stream of foot soldiers, shamans, demolishers, and mini-bosses. Some mobs fixate on random players, others drop healing totems or summon flame walls. There's not much variation. Just a wave after wave of enemies that take time to burn through. Eventually, tower doors open, and your raid has to split up. A small group climbs the tower to defeat the lieutenants and take control of the anti-air cannons. This step was critical. If the tower group failed, the whole raid stalled. Once both towers were clear, the cannons would shoot Galakras out the sky, and only then does the actual boss phase begin. But by that point, most groups were already worn out. The final phase is just a large health pool with a few breath attacks, ad spawns, and positioning checks. By the time Galakras hits the ground, the real challenge is keeping everyone focused. To beat the boss, you had to assign teams to towers ahead of time, stagger cooldowns for the mini-bosses, and make sure nobody stood in fire during the 10+ minutes of trash packs. Most guilds didn't wipe because the boss was hard. They wiped because people got bored and stopped paying attention. This, like the previous spot, is another fight nerfed years later to allow players to solo the fight, so you could down it with only one cannon double tapping it instead of requiring both at the same time. And at number 3, we have Rygelon from Sepulcher of the First Ones in Shadowlands. Rygelon is one of the most exhausting bosses in modern WoW. Not because of wild gimmicks or massive RP intros, but because it demanded perfect execution every single pull. The arena is a simple circular platform floating in the cosmos. The boss doesn't have much, but the entire boss fight is spent reacting to everything he throws at you non-stop. He hits tanks with stacking debuffs that eventually force a swap. He targets random players with cosmic damage that leaves behind orbs. If these orbs aren't soaked properly, they explode and wipe the group. But soaking them deals heavy damage to the player, so healers have to be perfectly timed every time. At the same time, Rygelon periodically casts an ability that sends players into another realm, the Quasar phase. A small group has to go in, kill ads quickly, and come back out without dying. Meanwhile, the rest of the raid continues the main phase and has to manage mechanics without those missing players. This is where most groups wipe. If someone failed to soak, died in the realm, or even used a cooldown at the wrong time, everything would fall apart. On Mythic, the difficulty spiked even harder. Players had to stagger cooldowns with absolute precision, and certain mechanics overlapped in ways that left zero margin for error. It was one of the hardest walls in the race to world first, and even in heroic or normal, it caused massive burnout for raid teams trying to progress. It also made the raid a nightmare to pug, because one person could wipe the group by not getting a pull when they had Dark Eclipse. To beat Rygelon, you didn't need clever tricks, just consistency. Every orb soaked, every ad killed, every debuff handled. And that's exactly why players grew to hate it. It wasn't really hard, but it was exhausting. And at number 2, we have the Spine of Deathwing from the Dragon Soul in Cataclysm. Spine of Deathwing is supposed to be a dramatic turning point in the Dragon Soul raid. You're literally standing on Deathwing's back, tearing off his armor as he soars through the sky. It's one of those fights that sounds so much cooler in theory than it turned out to be in practice. The entire fight takes place on a narrow, curved platform, Deathwing's spine. The goal isn't to fight him directly, but to remove 3 armor plates by manipulating ads and fire. At set intervals, Deathwing rolls from side to side. If your raid doesn't group up properly, everyone gets thrown off and instantly dies. That means you have to deliberately shift a group back and forth to control the roll mechanic. It also means if you're soloing the fight years later, you have to literally move back and forth the entire fight. Standing still is not an option. Each armor plate is sealed down with a tendon, which is only exposed after you spawn an ad called a hideous amalgamation. This ad must absorb a precise number of smaller oozes scattered around the spine. Once it's charged, you bring it near the plate and kill it. This will trigger an explosion that rips the plate off and briefly exposes the tendon. Here's the problem. You only have a few seconds to kill this tendon before the armor slams shut again. Fail, and you have to repeat the whole process. And you do this 3 times, with every wipe representing the tedious setup, spawn ads, soak ooze, control the roll, dodge fire, and wait. To beat the fight, you needed tight control over raid movement, perfect DPS bursts on the tendon windows, and funny enough, a ton of healing. As most people may forget this fact, but this was one of the toughest healing fights ever made too. But no matter how geared you were, the fight couldn't be rushed. Mechanics were time locked and scripted. For a fight that didn't even have a boss you would fight, it was actually one of the hardest fights in the history of the game, taking a few other titles for itself. It's one of the hardest fights that was harder than the end boss of its raid, it's one of the hardest ad control fights, it's one of the hardest fights that required burst damage, and it's one of the hardest healing fights of all time. And on top of all of those accomplishments, it's also one of the most hated fights, but its throne may have finally been taken. And at number 1, we have Sylvanas Windrunner from the Sanctum of Domination in Shadowlands. Sylvanas should have been one of WoW's most iconic raid encounters. Instead, it became one of its most hated. Not because the mechanics were broken, but because the fight was long, drawn out, and overloaded with mechanics that just dragged it down. The fight is split into 3 phases. Phase 1 takes place in a circular arena where Sylvanas bombards the raid with a mix of spread and debuffs, line attacks, and movement-based mechanics. The biggest threat here is domination chains. Players get tethered and need to break the chains by running away. Too slowly and they die, too fast and someone else might get clipped. You do this while dodging arrows, soaking zones, and rotating cooldowns. Phase 2, the raid goes onto a long bridge suspended in the maw. Sylvanas leaps away and summons waves of ads, while your raid is forced to follow her down a narrow path. Along the way, you deal with orbs that need soaking, ads that must be interrupted, and constantly shifting platforms. This part of the fight wasn't just long, it was disorienting, with poor visibility and no room for error. Finally, in Phase 3, you return to a platform for a more traditional DPS burn. But Sylvanas keeps phasing out, pulling players into the air, silencing the raid, and marking half the group for death if mechanics aren't followed precisely. And the worst part? The final phase requires a lot of coordinated raid placement, something that takes practice. Practice you could only get after 7 minutes of attempts each and every pull. To beat it, raids had to treat it like a marathon. Each phase had to be executed cleanly, with every group member knowing their exact job. Failing once meant 12 plus minutes of repetition. By the time you finally killed her, it didn't feel exactly satisfying, but it was a relief. If the second phase was just half as long, I'm sure it wouldn't have been so much of a hated fight, but that was not the case. Same with Spine of Deathwing. The fight sounds so much cooler on paper than it ended up being. Fighting Sylvanas and then chasing her down chains in the maw as she tries to flee, only to pin her down and finally get a chance to finish her off. Only she doesn't even die. She doesn't even get to the execute range as the fight ends at 50% health. So a lot of classes don't even get to bring their A game. It's like everything about the fight was working against it. And maybe it's just a recency bias, but the overall community reaction to it was just negative across the board, making it an easy shoo-in for number 1.